On tonight's episode of Mr. Norris's In Case You Missed It, we'll look at the life and background of Andrew Jackson. From frontier dueling to the presidency, we talk about the life and times of Old Hickory. Hey, hi, hello, and what is up, everybody? And it's your host, Mr. Norris, the history teacher with the good hair. And tonight we're going to be talking about a very interesting character in history, Mr. Andrew Jackson, our 7th President of the United States. Now, this video is directly because of a chapter that we spent on Andrew Jackson in school, mostly on his presidency. But with this video, I'm going to talk about his background, his life coming up, and focus mostly on his life before he became president. You will learn that as president, he did some things that maybe weren't too great for our country, and have a lot of controversy around them. Though he is still beloved, especially in his time, he was beloved by people. And part of that is because of the mythos or interesting little stories that surround him and his background and what he had to go through to ascend and become the 7th President of the United States of America. So let's get into it. First of all, Andrew Jackson is the first president who comes from the frontier or west of the Appalachian Mountains. It's believed that he may have been born in Pennsylvania somewhere, or his parents arrived in Pennsylvania. They moved to the Carolinas, and he eventually settles in what becomes Tennessee. So he's the first president from the frontier. He grows up relatively poor, doesn't receive too much formal education. He does eventually become a lawyer and practice law, but as far as formal schooling, Andrew Jackson receives very little. From an early age, he is already behind the 8 ball. His dad dies about 3 weeks before he's even born, and this was in a freak logging accident, again, in the backwoods frontier of Tennessee. Now, at the age of 13, Andrew Jackson has 2 brothers, one who's a little bit older than him that's actually serving for the Revolutionary Army, and one around the same age as him. During the American Revolution, his older brother who is serving dies at the Battle of Stono Ferry due to heat exhaustion. So that's one brother down. Then the other 2 brothers, they decide that during the American Revolution, they're going to serve as couriers for the Continental Army, meaning that they're going to carry mail around between the front lines, between different positions, almost covertly. Well, the 2 brothers actually get captured by the British, and they're held for some time. And while they're held, a British officer tries to get Andrew Jackson to shine his shoes. And one thing that you will quickly learn about Andrew Jackson from this video is that you do not cross Mr. Andrew Jackson. Even as a 13-year-old boy, Andrew Jackson tells this British commander, this British soldier, no way, I'm not going to shine your shoes. And how does the British soldier retaliate? He takes out his sword and he lashes Andrew Jackson across the face, essentially. Andrew Jackson holds up his hand to defend himself, and he receives lacerations to his hand and head, scars that he'll have for the rest of his life. Eventually, his mom comes to reacquire her 2 boys, Andrew and his brother. And on their journey back to the Tennessee area, they all fall really, really ill and almost die. Andrew and his brother contract forms of smallpox, which was pretty common at the time. And just the long, arduous journey and travel makes them even more weak, even more sick. When they get back within a couple days, Andrew's brother dies, so he no longer has any siblings. His mom is able to heal him back to health, and he survives. But within a couple weeks, months' time, his mom catches a disease called cholera, and she dies. So from the age of 14, Andrew Jackson is now an orphan, basically has no family, and everything that he's going to get in his life going forward, he's going to have to scratch and claw, not crawl, that'd be weird, claw and fight for. So you kind of understand going forward why he is so eager to latch on to things and not really want to let them go and fight for everything that he has to get. He eventually becomes a representative for the new state, Tennessee, but only for a short time, for about a year. And he's really disillusioned with Washington, D.C. and how it operates. You know, you have a lot of career politicians, career thinking men who have gone to school, and that's what they do. And that's just not Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson's a wild brawler, frontierman kind of guy, which we're going to get into more. Once he leaves and resigns from being a representative from Tennessee, he goes into what eventually becomes pretty much what he was best at in his life, and that is serving in the military. He joins the Tennessee militia and quickly rises to the position of general of the Tennessee militia. And it's around this time in his life where he kind of gets notoriety for being infamous, if you will, as far as like dueling and fighting and getting into some controversies. Well, the first one that we're going to talk about is a duel between him and a man named Charles Dickinson. Now, what happened with Andrew Jackson is that he used to, be a gambling, partying kind of guy when he was a younger man. And one of the things that Andrew Jackson liked to do was race horses. Now, he actually made a bet against Charles Dickinson's father in a horse race. And essentially what happened is Dickinson's father, his horse didn't run in the race. And Andrew Jackson was like, well, since your horse didn't run, you lose, you owe me money. And Dickinson's father essentially eventually paid Andrew Jackson, but Jackson went around talking to people like, yeah, this guy's a bum. He didn't pay me. I had to chase him down, blah, 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 blah. Dickinson catches word of this, and he's like, what the heck's this Andrew Jackson's guy's deal? So he sends one of his buddies to a bar to go talk to Andrew Jackson and be like, hey, man, why are you trashing my friend's dad? While this guy's talking to Andrew Jackson, Jackson takes out his cane and beats the mess out of the guy. And this just leads to a bigger feud. Eventually, words are exchanged. They challenge each other to a duel. And at their duel, Dickinson was known to be a crack shot, a very good aim. Andrew Jackson tried to use this to his advantage, which lets you into the mind of Andrew Jackson. It's a little bold, a little daring, a little out there, right? He decides to let Dickinson shoot first, which, if he's a marksman, seems pretty dangerous, right? Dickinson shoots first, hits Andrew Jackson in the chest, barely misses his heart. Jackson remains standing, doesn't go down, but he knows that the rules of a duel back then, if you fired a shot and hit your opponent, you have to stand completely still and let your opponent return fire. And Jackson knows this. So he takes Dickinson's best shot. He levels his gun, slowly, calmly aims, boom, fires, kills Charles Dickinson. And actually, after that in Tennessee, a lot of people are kind of hesitant to associate with Andrew Jackson because he's kind of viewed as being like a cold-blooded killer after that. He goes on to then have a duel with one of the first governor of Tennessee, a guy named John Sevier. And basically what happened with that is one of Andrew Jackson's good buddies was also running for governor, and Sevier and this guy just really didn't get along very well, and that caused an exchange of words between Jackson and Sevier. And again, a common theme in Jackson's life, you do not cross him, and if you do, you better run for the hills because this man is going to come for you. Well, Sevier crossed a very serious line, and that's that he insulted Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel. Interesting little tidbit about Andrew Jackson, some juicy gossip, if you will. When he married his wife, Rachel, she was actually still married to another man, which for the time, early 1800s is a big no-no, right? That's definitely against, common moral decency of the time, right? So Sevier basically says to Andrew Jackson, like, you and your wife are cheaters. Take that. And Andrew Jackson was not about that. He was not about that at all. If anything, if you insulted him, you risked being killed. But if you insulted his wife, he wants blood. On two separate occasions, Andrew Jackson had to be held back from chasing John Sevier in public and firing his pistol at him. One time, John Sevier, the first governor of Tennessee, was hiding behind a tree trying to dodge Andrew Jackson's bullets, and somebody eventually had to pull Andrew Jackson away. Just, as the kids would say, absolute savage. His last really famous duel was a fight between two men named the Benton brothers. And essentially what happened is one of the Benton brothers served underneath Andrew Jackson in the Tennessee militia, and they got into some kind of disagreement. Well, in the middle of a town one day, Andrew Jackson and one of his friends got into a fight with Jesse and Thomas Benton. These were the two brothers' names. And it's essentially a fist fight that evolves into something way more serious. Andrew Jackson is shot in the shoulder, and his arm is badly wounded, and he's bleeding out. And a doctor comes to see Andrew Jackson, and he looks at it, and he goes, this just does not look good. I think we're going to have to take your arm off. We're going to have to amputate. And Andrew Jackson from his bed looks up at the doctor and says, I think I'll keep my arm. Right? Like, this is not your normal person. The doctor's like, all right, crazy man, keep your arm. Just please don't kill me, and you're bleeding everywhere. But whatever. It just goes to show you his toughness, right? It's also around this time that he's head general of the Tennessee militia that he acquires the nickname Old Hickory. And this is just because of how tough he is. His soldiers said that he was as tough as an old hickory tree, like he was made out of wood. If you ask me, I believe that he might have been the first Terminator, not Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm going to lean with Andrew Jackson. All these different times being shot, he still lives. He's killing dudes. He's the Terminator. I'm convinced. All right. He then goes on from being the Tennessee head general of their militia to becoming a master general in the United States Army. And this is around 1813, 1814. He leads massive successful victories against the Creek Indians in the South. And he also successfully defends New Orleans during the War of 1812 from a British invasion. In a battle lasting 2 hours right outside the city of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson and his men are able to kill or capture 2,000 British soldiers in 2 hours. This is the greatest army in the world, is getting mowed down by Andrew Jackson and his men. Super, super impressive, right? Again, Terminator, okay? So this kind of gains him fame all over the country. He becomes literally one of the most famous people in the country right after the War of 1812. After 1812, he kind of stays on the southern border of the United States. Remember, back then, Florida was controlled by the Spanish. He actually, and I'll outline this in a future video, Andrew Jackson, if you look at Florida on the map and have ever vacationed there and thought, I love Florida, their beaches are beautiful, Disney World. Do you know who you can thank for Florida? Andrew Jackson. The reason that we have Florida as a territory is because in 1817, Andrew Jackson and his forces conquered Florida from the Spanish, and they were so shook, as the kids say, they signed a treaty to the United States, signing that territory over because they feared crazy man Andrew Jackson. So thanks, Andrew Jackson, for Florida. Some other things that I maybe have not talked about, again, that are part of his background that add a little controversy to Mr. Jackson. He also owned lots of slaves. It's estimated that at any point in his life, he might have owned between 150 and 300 slaves. And depending on the sources that you read, there are some that say that he was really brutal to his slaves and encouraged whipping in order to keep them in line. But there are other sources that say that he gave them housing and clothing, that he even let them carry weapons on his property. But that is a part of his legacy, being really like an elite planter in Tennessee and owning a lot of slaves. After the conquest of Florida, he has eyes on the White House, seeing as he's literally one of the most famous people in the country. He is a senator for a few years, and eventually he will ascend to the White House. And even some of that like mythos and crazy interesting stories about him continues in the White House. In 1835, he is the first president to have an assassination attempt on him. This man named Richard Lewis jumps out in front of Andrew Jackson in Washington, D.C. with 2 single-shot pistols. He fires both. They both misfire. And Andrew Jackson's pretty old at this point, by the way. Andrew Jackson, like we've seen previously, takes his cane and beats the mess out of this guy. Again, it's like kind of his thing, just caning people. God, somebody's got to stop this man. Anyway, long story short, Andrew Jackson's Secret Service has to pull Andrew Jackson off of his assassin. Usually the Secret Service is diving in the way, stopping an assassin from killing the president. These guys are like, we need to stop the president from killing the assassin. Now, as we go forward, you'll see that Andrew Jackson does some things as president that are highly questionable, to say the least. And as far as how he's viewed in history, he's a super controversial figure. But some of his background experiences and some of the things that he went to, being literally maybe the first president to come from nothing and having to fight and claw his way all the way up, it does add a somewhat redeemable quality to him. Not totally redeemable, but you can understand why people of his time revered him and admired him, and why even some people today think that, to be honest, some of his stories are kind of cool. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, comment, or subscribe if you did. Remember that history is life, and in the words of General George Washington, the surest basis for public happiness is knowledge. So go out there and get some. Have a good one, everybody.